It's been a year of mixed fortunes for Green politicians. In the US, Jill Stein could have a big say in the presidential race. Yet the Greens fared badly in European elections this year. So as the climate crisis worsens, are Greens winning or losing influence around the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, green politics were once fringe issues promoted by radical voices, you could say, on the sidelines, protesting about protecting the environment. But today, the worsening climate crisis means green policies are centre stage. It's seen the one-time protest movement make it to government in 11 European countries and also in New Zealand in recent times. And in next week's US presidential election, voters in many states can pick Green Party candidate Jill Stein. Her performance could have a big say on whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris who makes it to the White House. But what is the real influence of the Greens in global politics at a critical time in the climate crisis? Can they meet the political challenge from those opposed to policies intended to meet climate change targets? We'll be speaking to our guests in just a few moments after this report from Kulsum Sharif.
The two US presidential candidates offer contrasting views on climate change. Republican Donald Trump has called it a scam. When he was president, he pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Democrat Kamala Harris considers climate change an existential threat. As with much in American politics, environmental issues are yet another dividing line in an already polarized nation. But voters have a third choice, the Green Party candidate. Some believe the party's strong climate stance has been overshadowed by another issue.
We will free Palestine.
Jill Stein is on the ballot in almost all states, but her calls to end Israel's war on Gaza have been heard more loudly, perhaps, than her calls to address the climate emergency.
We are the one pro-worker, anti-war, anti-genocide, climate emergency, pro-reparations, pro-abolishing student debt, free public higher education. We're offering what the American people are demanding.
Meanwhile, in Europe, Green parties performed poorly in the European Union elections in June, wiping out spectacular gains made in the previous vote. Greens, especially in Germany, have strongly supported sanctions against Russia for the Ukraine war, impacting fuel prices. A cost of living crisis and economic uncertainty in Europe have hit voters hard. Tough times have made implementing the EU's green policies, the so-called Green Deal, more difficult. And they are under attack from resurgent populist and right-wing parties.
The far right is not interested in doing legislation on the Green Deal. If you look at the last 5 years, they almost voted against all the elements of the Green Deal. So I think the centre now really needs to stand together and work on the Green Deal.
Europe's farmers rallied against green policies over the past 2 years, rejecting calls to limit use of chemicals in agriculture and other environmental regulations. Some voters say their opposition reflects the wider political difficulties in implementing green policies.
It's disappointing the Greens performed so poorly. They're the only party that actually does something sensible, but they're being sabotaged because everyone wants to protect the environment, but never at their own expense.
While politicians and voters argue, experts warn the climate crisis is worsening. Across the world, countries have been ravaged with floods, droughts and wildfires, with loss of life, livelihoods and huge economic repercussions. While the Greens led the way as a protest movement in highlighting these issues decades ago, they face new challenges today, operating within the political mainstream across the world. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Washington, D.C., Hans Noel, Professor of Government at Georgetown University. In South Devon, England, George Monbiot, an author and environmental activist. And in Bujumbura, Anne-Marie Bihirabake. She's the Vice President of the Burundian Green Movement and President of the East Africa Green Federation. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Hans. So the news peg, of course, is we have an election very soon in the United States. Let me start, Hans, by asking you, what do the Greens stand for?
Well, in the United States, the Green Party is, an attempt to be sort of a reflection of the Green Party internationally. But it also is just a third-party challenge protest type party, because most of the interests that the Green Party stands for are also incorporated into the Democratic Party. And so it's really people who are not satisfied with how much the Democratic Party is paying attention either to those issues or, in this election, to other issues, particularly the United States handling of the conflict in Gaza. So people who want to see a more pro-Gaza position out of the United States government want the Democrats to do more than they already are doing. The Republicans are on the other side for sure. And a lot of voters are going to use the Green Party as a vehicle for expressing that idea.
That is a really interesting point. And I'm wondering, George, in Devon, we've got to ask then, listening to Hans, what attracts people to vote for the Greens? Is it belief in their principles and policy agenda, or is it often simply a protest vote against one or both of the sort of establishment parties?
I mean, it can be either, it can be both. We've seen the Greens come and go over many decades, sometimes doing really well in elections, sometimes much less well. And it's quite hard to attribute that pattern to any clear pattern of external factors. I think sentiment changes, and I would love to see Greens everywhere doing much better than they are, but it's always an afterthought. I mean, in your introduction, you say, well, green issues were once on the sidelines. They're still on the sidelines. There has never been a time when environmental issues are front and center and given the prominence they deserve, which, they should be right at the front of our minds. This is the greatest predicament humanity has ever faced. And yet we scarcely talk about it. When you look at the news bulletins, it's right down there towards the bottom, if it's there at all.
Interesting too. Anne-Marie in Bujumbura, I guess Greens in Africa, like other people elsewhere all around the world, they must be watching this US election. How are they seeing this? And are the priorities for Greens in Africa and the global south the same as for Greens in the global north in places like the US?
First of all, Greens in all the world are the same. We defend the same ideology. As I also represent Africa Green Federation, the whole Africa. I'm the vice president, and I'm also representing Africa in the Global Greens Coordination. As Greens, we have the same ideology. So Greens are seen, first of all, in Africa as a good area for protecting the planet, of protecting the human rights. We put in the priority human development in front of everything. We are against violence. We fight whatever comes to fight people. Humanity should be in the center of development. We defend ecological wisdom of management of the resources.
Let me take the question back to Hans in Washington, D.C. And no matter how strong the common green ground is, will Jill Stein's major role in this election be simply to decide how much vote or power Kamala Harris gets and whether she makes it into the White House or not, depending on how much she eats from support for the Democrats? Is that the way you see it, Hans?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely what it comes down to. I mean, one thing we can be pretty confident about with this election is that Jill Stein is not going to be the next president of the United States. We don't know much else. It's very, very close. And when it's close, any little thing can matter. So it's quite possible that the margin of victory in the handful of swing states that end up determining the outcome will be smaller than the number of votes that Jill Stein gets. We can't be sure where those votes are coming from. Maybe those are people who wouldn't have voted at all, but probably those are people who would have voted for the Democrat because the green interests, those common interests we were just discussing, they are, reflected in the Green Party here, but they are also reflected in the Democratic Party. The way we build coalitions in the United States is just different. And so the green interests are very much also represented in the Democratic Party. And ironically, if Jill Stein draws a lot of votes away from people who might otherwise vote Democratic because they want a bolder agenda, she may end up actually helping Donald Trump win the election.
All right, so they're not going to make it into power in the US in this election, but George, they did make it into power as part of coalition governments in a number of European countries. There was a bit of a green surge, I think we can say, going on the last few years in Europe. But then when you look at June parliamentary elections in the EU to local elections in September in Germany, you start to wonder, are the Greens in retreat now?
No question. Almost everywhere there's been a backlash against green policies. And that
Why is that, George?
It's partly been driven by the rise of the far right. The far right is extremely antagonistic to green policies, and unfortunately, the public conversation often tracks that shift in politics. As people turn rightward, we hear less and less about environmental issues, or we hear bad things. You shouldn't invest in green policies. Climate scientists apparently are trying to rip you all off because obviously if you want to get really rich, become a climate scientist, not say an oil executive. And there's some really stupid narratives around, driven by climate science denial, often funded by fossil fuel companies. And unfortunately, a lot of people have succumbed to those stupid narratives. But there's also all sorts of distractions happening. We are constantly distracted, and culture wars have been a very effective distraction from the really important issues. And of course, the most important issues of all are the issues concerning our life support system, the Earth system, and whether it can continue to support us, whether the living planet will continue to be a habitable and hospitable environment for humanity, or whether it becomes hostile to us. Everything else fades into the background by comparison to this question. It should be front and center all the time, but it's constantly pushed aside.
Anne-Marie, as parts of the North at least get embroiled in what George is describing there as false narratives and distractions, I'm wondering, do Greens in Africa feel the global North is shouldering its responsibilities towards the global South?
Not every time, because we can say that in South we are affected by the bad policies made by global North, and we even require for reparation for. They have to pay what they damage. So the global North affect a lot the climate change. So we in Africa we suffer a lot for the bad policies, the bad actions, the industrialization. We really need to that they would think about how they act. We call upon the responsibility from them.
Hans, how important is what happens in November elections in the US, not only to the Greens in the US, but also to the fate of the Greens elsewhere around the world?
Well, at least in terms of the policies that Greens advocate for, it's a big impact. It really is going to matter a lot. The United States does need to, be, needs to be a leader if this is a policy area that you care a lot about, or to put it a different way, whatever the United States does just has a huge impact on how things play out elsewhere. And so if Donald Trump is elected and he either himself or the coalition he puts together doesn't care about addressing climate change, thinks it's a hoax and a scam, and there's a mix of people on the Republican side. Some of them feel strongly about that, some of them don't, but that's the direction that a Republican administration would go. Or if Harris wins, then you would see an administration that wants to embrace a Green New Deal and wants to do some of these things that are advocated for, possibly not as much as some Green voters would want, but a lot more. It's important to know that, because we organize our coalitions differently in the United States, most of the Green interests are in the Democratic Party, and those interests are going to translate into what kind of leadership the United States demonstrates on this issue and, frankly, others in the next 4 years.
Okay, so the idea that voters expecting more of their elected leaders on some of those, we can call them green issues, but I'm wondering, George, have Green parties themselves lived up to expectations when they've participated in government on some of those key issues we've just heard now from Anne-Marie and Bujumbura, and we heard a moment ago in our report from Jill Stein talking about confronting war, violence, supporting human rights, protecting the environment. Let's face it, the Greens, they're part of a government in Germany. And I looked up a report by TNE in June that cited Germany as one of the 12 EU countries which are projected to fail in meeting their 2030 environment targets. The same German government, which human rights groups like Human Rights Watch are warned are risking complicity in war crimes by supplying weapons to Israel in the current conflict. Things like that. Does that undermine the success and reputation of what Green parties stand for?
Well, in fairness, in Germany, the Green Party has pushed back against both of those positions. And of course, it hasn't been in sole charge in Germany. And, that's the nature of coalition. You don't get everything you want. The Greens do keep trying.
Yeah, do you think people make that discernment, or do they put some of the blame on the Greens too?
Not always. Governments and partners in government get blamed for all sorts of things that they can't control. Voters aren't necessarily very discerning about who's responsible for what or why they might be in a difficult situation. And as we often see, unfortunately, people can vote directly against their own interests in elections. This has happened again and again and again, and we fear that it might happen in the US very shortly. So, yes, the Greens have always been on the back foot in politics. Politics doesn't respond very well to the Green agenda because a huge amount of politics is driven by money, and the organizations with the greatest incentive to pour money into politics are the dirtiest and most antisocial corporations, because if they don't pour money into politics, they will be regulated out of existence. So the dirtiest and most antisocial corporations come to dominate politics. That's called the pollution paradox. And we end up with the worst possible people exercising the greatest influence. And that's a very difficult environment for Green parties anywhere in the world to operate in.
Interesting. So we're talking about how the system may favour or not favour some parties. I've got to take this back then to Hans in the US. Does the system there prefer the two mainstream parties or prefer two parties, Hans? Is that what makes it even more difficult for people like parties like the Greens to make progress?
Well, it's definitely true that our system favors a two-party system for a whole host of reasons. So with single-member districts and first-past-the-post voting, it values being able to come in first, which means if you're, a third or fourth party, then you're not going to be able to do that. Also, our party system is really permeable, so that if you want to influence politics, you don't need to form a third party. You can enter into the existing parties and reshape them, which, of course, is what's happened with environmental politics in the United States. And one reason why the Green movement doesn't seem to be as much attached to the Green Party in the United States, that movement is, playing out within the Democratic Party.
So we've seen, for example,
so
hands like when Joe Biden announced the green transition and his green agenda, that basically is part of a pattern of mainstream parties adopting the green agenda, leaving green parties with little to appear relevant to voters?
Well, I mean, yeah, so little to appear relevant to voters. But I mean, the other way to say it is if your interests are being represented in a different way, then it doesn't matter whether or not green parties are winning or Democratic Party is winning if the Democratic Party is doing what you would like them to do. And, there's different ways of organizing things have different consequences. We were just discussing about in Germany the difficulty that the Green Party has building and coordinating with its governing coalition when it joins that. It's the same thing in the United States. It's just that it's not the Green Party that is in that governing coalition. It's the green elements, the green interests that are part of the Democratic Party. And if I care about that issue, I don't really care whether or not Green Party politicians get into office. I care about whether or not those policies get implemented. And I think in multiple cases, what you see is a struggle for those issues for the reasons that we've just been discussing.
All right. Let me take it back to Anne-Marie in Bujumbura. As we see Green politicians struggle in the US, as we see the Greens on the retreat, taking a step back in European elections, how does that impact Greens around the world, particularly in the global South and Africa?
As you could imagine, in Africa it is worse because in our countries, voters do not look at the good policies, do not look at the good ideologies. They look to those traditional political parties that can give something. The ones that have held every resources in the country. So we struggle in the whole countries in Africa. We struggle to get into power. On very few countries have MPs, have elected people. So we really struggle because we do not have enough resources to mobilize people, enough resources to... I can say that in Africa there is a lot of corruption. So people are vote just because they are corrupted, just because they have something. So we get a lot of problem to influence the policies to get into power. It is a big problem. It is a huge problem, I can say.
George, what does the future hold for the Greens, do you think, when you look into your green crystal ball?
Well, a bit like Hans, I'm much more interested in what the future holds for environmental policy than it holds for green parties in particular. I mean, much as I want to see them prosper, it is the policies that count, and Hans is completely right about that. And we need to see those policies mainstreamed, regardless of which party is in power. Unfortunately, that just does not happen, which is why we still need the green parties there to act as a kind of irritant, as a prod to the other parties to say, why aren't you dealing with it? Now, I am worried that Stein might take away crucial votes from Harris in the US and usher Trump in. And I think, that is a real danger. At the same time, it's really important that we have people outside the two main political parties saying you should be pushing much harder on these issues. And it has been very striking in the Harris campaign that, while we know she is broadly sympathetic to taking action to prevent climate breakdown, she has scarcely talked about it at all. It is the great roaring issue that nobody is hearing about. It just hasn't featured large in this election at all. And yet, from the environmental point of view, this is an existential election. I mean, if Donald Trump takes power, then that could be the end of effective global climate action. He's going to tear up coalitions which are aiming to prevent catastrophic climate breakdown. He will do so gleefully. He'll just rip up environmental rules left, right, and centre. And so, we urgently need this issue to be mainstreamed. Why aren't we hearing much more of it
All right,
from the
that's a good
Democrats.
point. I saw Anne-Marie for a moment nodding your head. I think do you have something to chime in to say about that, the idea that the most important thing is the green agenda makes it through to the mainstream rather than who makes it to power?
All people all over the world need to be realistic. The climate change negative impact are in reality, and we need to be talked by those what we see. We need to change. We need to be conscious that climate change. We need to follow politics that think about that, because.
But Anne-Marie, do you think green parties in Africa
So,
see that sort of sentiment which George was talking about? That they know, for example, that their main success is impacting the policies of mainstream parties rather than realistically hoping to take power in Africa?
Yes, exact. We need to mainstream this philosophy, and we need to put into action and to put resources in protecting environment, in implementing the agreement. In all COPs, they make good agreements, but they don't put in action what they agree. So we need Greens,
Right.
political Green parties to implement all the agreement. We need to implement Paris Agreement. We need to implement all good agreement we made in the COPs.
Let me try and bring in a quick
resources.
final word, if I could. Sorry, Anne-Marie, but I think we've just got 30 seconds left. I'm going to try and give a quick final word to Hans in Washington, D.C. Hans, given everything we've discussed, is there a role for the Greens beyond simply impacting the mainstream parties? Is there a path to power for the Greens? And is there a path to power beyond simply coalitions?
I mean, I think in the United States, the path to power for green interests runs through the existing party system. It is not going to displace one of the existing parties, short of some radical change in our institutions. And so the path to influence and power is to make this issue be one of the issues that is very, very central to what it means to be a Democrat. I think actually the green interests have done a lot of progress on that front, and there's a lot more to be done. And that's the place where you will see any change, not whether or not Jill Stein gets votes or not.
Fantastic. This has been a really good show, and to thank all of our guests. We managed to get in a lot of different issues, a lot of different perspectives from right around the globe. Let's thank Hans Noel, George Monbiot, and Anne-Marie Bihirabake. And thank you for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.